Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second installment of our Facebook Live Meet Our Author series, supporting our local authors and illustrators. My name is Teresa Mayfield, and I'm a local history librarian here at Moore Memorial Public Library. Before we get started, don't forget to hit that share button on your device to let all of our friends know that we have now gone live. Also, if you have any questions, put them in the comments section, and we'll get it to our panel by the end of the presentation. So let's get started. Today we have with us an amazing panel. Local historian authors Chris O'Shea Roper and Dr. Tom Linton and Joe Hoover are here to talk about their book, Legacy of the Early Gulf Coast Cowboys. They will blend historical research and personal anecdotes from family descendants to shed light on some of the original cowboys of the Gulf Coast saltgrass prairies. Miss O'Shea Roper is a freelance writer and an editor, having collaborated on over 60 books, numerous papers, and more than 200 news articles. She and Tom Linton have worked together on a number of coastal ecological issues. Their previous book from 2015, Water is for Fighting Over, continues to be a valuable resource on the future of water management in Texas. Miss Roper is a Texas certified master naturalist, and she has had a home on the coastal prairie of Southeast Texas for more than 20 years. Dr. Tom Linton is a biologist by training with 30 years' experience in the field of marine resource management. For many years, Dr. Linton served on the faculty of the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries Science at Texas A&M University, retiring 2002 emeritus, and joining the faculty of Texas A&M Galveston, retiring 2017 emeritus. He was raised on the coastal prairies of South Texas and brings his unique experiences in the area to life in many of his book chapters. Joe Hoover is a registered architect, a registered interior designer, and a member of the American Institute of Architects. In 1960, he organized his architectural firm and for 58 years has completed numerous projects, including several that received outstanding design awards. Although architecture was his career path, he continues his interest in painting and drawing in mixed media and was the featured artist in the 2009 annual Texas City Art Festival. We welcome all of our panelists here today, and let's get started.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Teresa, for inviting us. We're very happy to be here to share the legacy of the early Gulf Coast Cowboys. You've heard our formal introduction. I'd like to give you a little bit of an informal introduction as well. Tom and Joe, who are sitting to my right, your left, have been good friends forever and ever. That's a long time. And they still get together to talk about stories about the early Gulf Coast Cowboys. Remember when, some of them may be true and some of them may be not. But at one point, they started talking about putting it all together in a book. And at that point, Joe even started drawing some of the beautiful illustrations that you will see throughout this presentation as well as throughout the book. And Tom, who is our inveterate storyteller, has been telling stories for years, started writing some of them down, stories about working on his family's ranch, stories about branding cattle, some that may or may not have made it into the book. And along with the historical parts that I put together, we think we've put together a pretty good story of the early Gulf Coast Cowboys. At one point, Tom and I were working on a totally different project, and he came to me and he put a big cardboard box on the table in front of me, and he said, here it is. And I said, okay, here, what is? And he said, this is the cowboy book. And I looked into the box and I found a couple of books and a whole bunch of papers and notes and sticky notes and a thumb drive or two. And I thought, oh boy, put it aside for a while. But my curiosity got the best of me. And I finally picked it up and realized, yes, there is a story here and it's unique. It's one that's not been told before. And okay, I was hooked. And the story is that the early Gulf Coast Cowboys, we have heard this story that the Spanish taught the residents here, early residents of the Gulf Coast, saltgrass prairies, how to manage cattle. But we believe that there were 3 other groups just as important or more important, and this is their story. So I'm going to see if I can do the slides. Okay. First of all, there were Celtic Scots. These were people who lived in the northern part of Scotland, and the territory there is rough, rugged, mountainous terrain. It's not good for planting crops at all. So the people there historically have been raising cattle. This is where you find the beautiful Highland cattle. They've been managing and working cattle there for hundreds of years. In fact, there is an existing document from 1359, which is a permission to travel document that said a certain group of cattle drovers, thank you very much, drovers had permission to go from northern Scotland down what they called the drove roads through the southern part of Scotland into England to sell their cattle. 1359, a little bit before our time. During the ranchers that lived up there in the Highlands of Scotland were poor. They were tenant farmers, and they paid rents to English absentee landlords. During the Industrial Revolution, when sheep and wool became a much more lucrative crop, the absentee English landlords decided they didn't want the tenant farmers living on their property anymore, and they kicked them off. So they, over the course of about 100 years, they evicted the large percentage of the population in the Highlands of Scotland and brought in sheep farming in order to be able to sell the wool. Unfortunately, the population in that area never really has recovered. Many of them moved to the southern parts of Scotland, some into England, and many of them made their way to this country through North Carolina, particularly in the Cape Fear area of North Carolina, where they established significant cattle ranches. The next group is Acadians of French descent who had been living in sparse lowland areas of Nova Scotia. So there had been French people living in Nova Scotia since the middle of the 17th century, when Nova Scotia was owned by France. By the beginning of the 18th century, unfortunately for them, England conquered the area and was requiring an oath of allegiance from the French-speaking population in the area, and that did not go over well. By the middle of the 18th century, then, England decided that they had had enough of this, and they forced the Acadians from Nova Scotia, all of the French-speaking people, out. They came into the valleys with their soldiers. They burned homes and slaughtered, the records say, up to 100,000 cattle. And forced them out. Many of these French Acadians came through into and through Louisiana, and into western parts of Louisiana and into southeastern parts of Texas, and brought their cattle raising skills with them. The third group of people came not willingly. African tribesmen in northwest Africa, and there are significant documents that show that the people who lived in that area raised cattle for a living. The area was hot, it was arid, it was not suitable for raising crops, and so therefore they raised cattle. In fact, some of those cattle have been, even over the last 150 years, have been imported into this country because they were disease resistant and heat resistant, and they've been interbred with cattle in this country to make them more disease resistant and insect resistant. So it is quite likely that as some of these enslaved cattlemen, enslaved cowboys, made their way into the southern part of this country and made their way west, that they would have come with those cattle raising and cattle management skills. So this is a map that shows the tall saltgrass prairies of southwestern Louisiana and southeastern Texas, where all of these people would have come to live. Unfortunately, today only about 1% of these saltgrass prairies still exist. But the descendants of these early settlers continue to carry on their legacy, and some of those legacies are with us today. So let's talk about a few of the names, a few of the families that we have talked about in the book. This is one of Joe's beautiful illustrations. This shows the Broussard family coming through to Texas, coming through the piney woods of East Texas. In fact, two of the Broussard brothers were leaders of the resistance against the English in having to take the oath of allegiance up in Nova Scotia. So the Broussard family came. In fact, we have been in touch with, while we were writing the book, we were in touch with members of the Broussard family in Louisiana, and they have said that there are 8 generations of Broussards that can now document all the way back to the original Broussards who came from Nova Scotia. This is also, the drawing shows a cart, the kind of cart that they would have come across Louisiana and into Texas in. And you can see over in the bottom right-hand corner, the little dog is the Catahoula cur, which is the famous dog that's been bred by the Cajuns, continues to be bred by the Cajuns to help in their cattle raising. James Campbell, he and his wife Mary settled on the Saltgrass Prairie, where she actually raised the cattle and he ran with Jean Lafitte. This was kind of a fun story for us to research. So James Campbell was an interesting character to begin with. He was born in Ireland, but he became a sailmaker because he loved living on the water. In 1817, he and Mary came to Galveston, bringing their small children as well as a herd of cattle. He went off to, as I said, run as a pirate with Jean Lafitte. We know quite a bit about James and Mary Campbell because after Lafitte's time in Galveston, government officials came to interview both James and Mary in their later years to talk about their time with Jean Lafitte. And at one point, Mary was the only female with the pirates living here. But those of you who live around Galveston know about Campbell's Bayou. And so if you're not familiar with where it is, as you're going towards Galveston, just before you go over the Causeway Bridge, there's a large flat area of salt grass and salt marsh that is Campbell's Bayou. In fact, there's a historical marker right there by the freeway. And then the Butler family. The Butler family developed cattle ranching on the Saltgrass Prairie and helped establish what is now League City. They came from England through North Carolina, through Mississippi and Louisiana. Members of the family did. They came in the 1850s. They brought with them their cattle and their enslaved cowboys with them. Once after emancipation, some of the cowboys continued to work for the Butler family. They were paid wages at that point. They married, had children, and formed communities in the area, many of which have been have become historically part of the settlement, which is in Texas City. So every presentation needs a did you know kind of slide, and this is our did you know kind of slide. So this one has to do with taking cattle to market. We've always heard that cattle drives went from south to north to meet up with on the Chisholm Trail to meet up with the railroad taking cattle to market in the east. But the earliest cattle drives from here went from west to east rather than from south to north. The first one that we have record of took place in 1779 during the Revolutionary War when General Bernardo de Galvez, if I get his name correct,
Yes.
my pronunciation is not that good, he asked for permission from the Texas governor to take 2,000 head of cattle from Goliad and from San Antonio and the areas around there all the way east to New Orleans to sell to the army for the soldiers. So when someone asks you about the early cattle trails, early cattle drives from here, please tell them they went from west to east. And the best way to talk about a cattle drive is through Joe's gorgeous illustrations that are a big part of the book. And I'm going to turn this over to Joe in just a second, if I can get the slides to go. If I can get the slide to go. There you go.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you, Teresa, for the opportunity to talk to your library group. As Chris says, Tom and I have known each other way back from junior high school, and we played a lot of Cowboys. And Western art has always been an interest of mine, like the Charlie Russell beautiful paintings. And when he mentioned the fact that he would like for me to illustrate some of the stories on the trails, that the book he was writing, I immediately got on board for it. As a matter of fact, the book is a very visual book because not only my illustrations, but there's over 100 pictures, photographs, maps included in the book, and it could really be a coffee book if somebody doesn't like the historical part. But I've got 2 or 3 illustrations here of stories, true stories. Of course, they didn't have photography back in those days, but true stories of incidents that happened on the trail. And the first slide here is a picture that illustrates a group of ex-slaves from the settlement that Chris mentioned in West Texas City, which a group of ex-slaves bought some property, and it's interesting that they ran their slave masters after they were emancipated. They ran his cattle up the Chisholm Trail, which is a north-south trail, to the rail yards in Kansas City, or the rail yards up there, wherever. But the house is actually still in existence. It's the Frank Bell House, and it's a typical Acadian house that the city of Texas City has reconstructed and preserved, and you can still see the house. But this illustrates a group of ex-slaves that were cowboys getting ready, prepared to go on up the trail, the Chisholm Trail. And you notice that there is a chuck wagon there, and just as a side incident, the chuck wagon was invented, I guess you'd say, by Charles Goodnight, a panhandle cattleman. And what he did is, after the Civil War, he bought a couple of wagons from the Army, surplus wagons, and he attached a food box on the back. And that's where, of course, we all know that they prepared the food for the drovers. And also the wagon was used for the other personal effects, bedrolls and so forth, for the drive. Next slide, Chris. The next slide is, as I say, these were illustrations of things that happened on the trail. And there was a trail that connected to the Opelousas Trail, called the Old Beef Trail, that went through East Texas and all the way down into Louisiana to connect with the Opelousas Trail. on their drives to New Orleans. And I researched, and I could find plenty of pictures of cattle drives everywhere, but none through the deep East Texas woods. And you can imagine the problems that they had driving these cattle and trying to keep them together going through the deep East Texas woods and the western Louisiana woods. You all driven through East Texas and western Louisiana, and you know what I'm talking about. But they managed. I'm sure they lost a lot of cattle during that time. And you may notice that the cattle in this picture are of all breeds, of all kinds, from longhorns to Indian cattle, and that's what they were. The feral cattle were just every kind of mixed cattle together. As I said, I don't know if you can imagine, next slide, a number of bayous and rivers and woods and swamps and everything that the cattle drive had to cross between East Texas and New Orleans. This is an illustration of a man by the name of Sterling Spell. Sterling was a big old rugged fellow, 250 to 80 pounds, 6'4", and the city of Beaumont, which was south down of their river crossing on the not Natchez River. On the Natchez River, a few miles above Beaumont, it was a low water crossing, and the city of Beaumont, the cattle drivers would use this low water crossing, and of course a big amount of their herd would drown while they were crossing. So the city of Beaumont got so fed up of cleaning up the carcasses of the dead cattle they'd float to Beaumont, that they made all the cattle drivers put a bond up to pay for them cleaning up the dead cattle. And so this has all been documented in the Beaumont News and other reports about Mr. Spell. But anyway, they would so all the cattle drivers got to where they would hire Mr. Spell to do the crossing for them. And of course, he would take the lead bull by the horns. So this is where the bull by the horns came from, and swim him across the Natchez River there. And this went on for years up until right before the Civil War. And of course, after the Civil War, that's when the cattle drives went to the Chisholm Trail, north and south. And so that's pretty much the story. That there's several other illustrations, and they're all about stories on the trail, and I think you would enjoy reading about them.
Thanks, Joe. I'm going to turn it over to Tom at this point.
This book resulted in one of the greatest disappointments in my life. I grew up, Chris said I grew up on the Saltgrass Prairie. I grew up about a mile from here, over just off of Logan Avenue. And we had cattle around here. But the reason I was so disappointed, in an earlier book that I wrote about parks, I went to Goliad and I found a book up there about the influence of Texas beef in the American Revolution. And the first cattle drive was to the east. I had grown up thinking that it was a documentary, that it was a fact of life, that John Wayne and Montgomery Clift in that documentary Red River was showing that the first cattle drive was to the west. When John Wayne let you down, you can't have much faith in anything much after that, now can you? But anyway, it led on to us doing this book. Now, Hoover and I have always wanted we, like you said, we've known one another forever. And we've always wanted to try to do something. We've done a lot of things together, but we wanted to do something together that was productive and worthwhile. And I think we did it in this book. So anyway, we started looking at where these people came from that were involved in the cattle business. And as he said in another presentation or elsewhere, this was ground zero for the cattle business. I mean, right here where we're talking about in Galveston, Chambers County. Over in Chambers County, the White Ranch, James Taylor White, came out of Louisiana in 1817 the first time, and then finally in 1819 established a ranch over in Chambers County that is still in existence today. The people that came out of Nova Scotia came to St. Martinsville, and most all of the cattle people that came in through Louisiana and developed the cattle business there and came into Texas came through St. Martinsville. Cowboy in life is not an easy one. There is a song or poem or whatever. When those guys were out there, you know, after they'd worked 14 hours a day riding along in the dust, they'd sing, get songs and write poems. But one that tells a story of a cowboy on the trail. Sometimes it's dreadfully stormy. Sometimes it's pretty clear. You may work a month, you might work a year, but you will make a winning if you'll come alive and try. For the whole world over, boys, it's root hog or die. Because this is a thing that came from the earliest settlers when they ran the hogs free in the woods, and if the hog didn't make it through the winter on its own, they died. And so a cowboy, if he couldn't make it to another trail drive and couldn't make it through those, either not getting shot or broken up by the cattle or bitten by a snake or something of that sort, he had to root hog or die. And so to try to make it understood what it was like to be on a cattle drive. They've mentioned that I grew up, we had cattle in the woods. There was open range in East Texas when I was a kid, and we grew up, my grandparents, my father and my uncles, they all ran, and other kinfolk, they ran cows in the woods. And so we'd go out and at certain times of the year, bring them in, mark and brand the calves, check on the cattle. And you have spent a day, as I did once, when we would all get together, the families, they would bring in their cattle and we'd go and we'd mark and brand the calves. One day we did 97 calves, and we young bucks would be the ones that they'd send out and, okay, go rope that calf over there and throw him down so we can brand him. And the whole family would be there. So there'd be a lot of girls around. And as a young buck, you enjoy throwing that calf down and showing that girl what a real cowboy you were. And after 97 of them, you forgot that you were trying to impress anyone. All you wanted to do was just lie down in the shade and rest. Cowboying is not an easy thing. Cattle drives started here in Texas and this area, as this being the ground zero part of the cattle country, going east and then finally to the west. But they started here essentially, and they ended here essentially. You got a, is that slide up, Chris?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, that's a picture of a cattle loading railroad site in League City. The city of League City is named for J.C. League, who was a developer from the north, who came down. He and George Washington Butler talked the railroad into bringing a railhead into League City. And so when you had rail cars that came in, and you could bunch up the cattle and put them on those cars and send them to the north, you didn't have to drive the cattle anymore. So cattle business, the cattle drives started here, and the cattle drives ended here. The portion of the bit about the ex-slaves that worked for Butler, or were slaves to Butler, and when emancipation came and they were freed, then they became wage-earning cowboys and drove cattle up and down the Chisholm Trail with their cattle and Butler's cows and others that they could gather up. One of the first members of that group that started this settlement, there were 3 families that started this settlement, which is still in existence down in West Texas City, was Calvin Bell. Calvin Bell was a cowboy. He'd been a slave, became a wage-earning cowboy. But his family has been in the cattle business, and up until almost present time, they still were in it. I would go, when I was doing research on this, every year they have a gathering at the settlement, celebrating the settlement and the history of the place. And Ms. Gary, who is a belle, is the lady who causes this to happen and is the ramrod of the deal. So I got to know her, and we'd stand and I'd listen to people talk, and I'd be talking with her. And she said, you know, my great-granddaddy had the first cattle brand given that was licensed to a black man in Galveston County. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And I said, where is it? And she said, I don't know, some of the family's got it. And I said, you know, they're starting an African-American museum up in Washington, D.C., and they're looking for artifacts to go in that museum. And I think that would be really something great. And I said, why don't you see if you can help get the family to track that down? And she said, oh, I don't know. I said, well, it'd be worthwhile trying. And so she called me one day and she said, we got it. And I said, what? And she said, the branding iron. I said, oh, yes, the branding iron. I said, where is it? And she said, one of the great nieces found it. It was in a shoebox up in a closet out in Los Angeles, California. And I said, what are they going to do with it? And she said, I don't know. I said, well, I know that guy that's the interim head of the African American Museum in D.C. I'll get in touch with him and see if he'd be interested in it. So I called him. He said, oh, my, yeah, we'd love to have that. So I put those people in touch with him. They went to Washington, D.C. with their little 8-year-old daughter and made a presentation of that branding iron to the African American Museum. And it is now on display in the African American Museum, saying a branding iron that belonged to Calvin Bell from West Texas City, Galveston County, which was one of the first branding irons issued to a black man in Galveston County. So that carries on the history of what happened to perpetuate the story of the cattle business from ground zero here in Galveston and Chambers County. How am I doing on time? You're doing great. I'm doing great. Okay, I'm going to tell you another story. The reason that people go on the cattle drive is because they were starving to death. One of the things in Red River is really actual, because there were cattle everywhere. The place was crawling with them, but you couldn't sell them, you couldn't give them away. And so actually what is shown in that Red River, where they gathered up every cow they could get into a herd and drive north, they were starving to death. The people that went to the east, and there were many other cattle drives after that initial cattle drive that took cattle over to Bernardo Galvez to help feed his troops. There was people out of Liberty, Texas, that this guy would go down into around Refugio and start talking to people. A guy to have 3 cows, 10 head, and he'd gather up a bunch, about 500 head. And back to what Joe Hoover said, I can't imagine. I have driven along I-10 to New Orleans. Can you imagine what it was like back then when you didn't have any off or fly spray to drive through that country, ford all those rivers, fight off all those mosquitoes, dodge all those water moccasins and rattlesnakes and alligators? They must have been pretty hard up. But to back up and talk a little bit about our book, the end of it, and we have a picture of that famous picture of the Indian on a horse and at the end of the trail when he is just before he died. One of the things that jumped out to me or really caught my interest was Louis L'Amour, who is a famous writer about about cattle drives. He said, the trail is the thing, not the end of the trail. Trail to last, and you miss if you travel the trail and don't pay attention to what's around, you will miss all of what you're traveling for. It's the trail, the essence of it, and the adventures that you have on it. And many of you may remember that you did something, and this is another hark back to what Chris said about Joe Hoover and I. we go back to junior high school, and we get together and we tell the same old stories, and we laugh just as much about those same old stories as we did when we first did them. And so that's what being on the trail is about. Me remembering branding 97 calves and impressing a few country girls and going out in the woods and bringing in a bunch of cattle. And one of the stories in there is when they, in 1948, they closed the open range up in Polk and Trinity County, where my people come from. And so we were out gathering up a bunch of cows and moving them in. And they broke through a fence, and I was riding on a horse that she was like a magnet. A cow was like a piece of iron to a magnet. She'd stay on them. If you could stay on her, you'd herd that cow. And so the cow broke through the brush and was running through the woods, and the horse was running, and I was hanging on for dear life, dodging limbs and brush. And all at once, there was nothing in front of me as the horse just went out, her legs pawing high, and we went over a little bank. The cow had already gone down there, and she fell down. The cow fell on its side. The horse came right in on her and bit her and made her get up, and she took off through the brush again, went back to that cut in the fence, got out on the road. She held her head high, and when you see a woods cow, they are a different bunch than these things you see in the woods. I mean, in a feedlot. They have dignity. She hoisted her tail in the air, head to the side, shaking her tail, went back and got in the group of cows that we're bringing in. And she thumbed her nose at me. I will remember those kind of things all my life. We did this book. We enjoyed doing it. We enjoy getting together and talking about it. We enjoy getting together and getting in front of others and telling them about it. I hope you've enjoyed this. And we will stand for questions now, I guess.
Thank you. We will. Okay. We have a few questions that were provided to us by Teresa earlier. I'm going to start with Tom. Here's a question for you. I'm the one who gets to assign these questions. This is a great, powerful position. Tom, what part of your research surprised you the most?
Oh, the importance of the Opelousas Trail and the importance of Galveston and Chambers County in the development of the cattle business, and the fact that trail driving cattle essentially may have had an origin here, but ended here with Butler and Lee getting that railhead here.
Oh, thank you. Okay, there's a question for Joe. What was your inspiration for the artwork?
The stories themselves. I think they're just fascinating.
Okay. I'll take the third question because it has to do with the publishing process. What was the experience like to go through the publishing process? I don't know why he's laughing next to me, other than the fact that I made life miserable for the two of them, probably. I've done this a number of times. So I will tell you, I want to share this with you. So most books are printed in this kind of an orientation, and this is called portrait orientation. You open the book like this, and you read it. Because particularly of Joe's illustrations, the majority of them were actually done what's called landscape, this way. So we wanted the book to be printed this way in order to maximize the value of and show the beauty of Joe's illustrations. It was very difficult for us to find a printer who was willing to do that. So we must have talked to 3 or 4 different printers before we finally twisted somebody's arm and got him to do this. But you can see in the middle of the book where Joe's illustrations go along with the text and just magnify it beautifully. We also had to make sure that the printer was capable of printing to a quality that was satisfactory to Joe, because when he gets angry, he's a bear. So we worked with a couple of different printers and had them take his originals and print them up for us as if it was in the book on the paper that would be used. And then, of course, we had to find someone who would do a cover for us. Mary Jo Livingston, who is a graphic designer in Galveston, helped us with this. We wanted them to look like ghosts, so we did the background, which is actually a part of Galveston Bay, and then Joe's illustrations of the three different early Gulf Coast cowboys, the Scott, the Acadian, and the enslaved, were superimposed on top of it, but so that you could see through it. So those were kind of the challenges. The rest of the challenge had to do with making sure I could balance the historical parts of the story with Tom's wonderful and personal stories as well, and balance that with the artwork. So that was a bit of a challenge to get it all together, but well worth it. As Tom and Joe have both said, we loved the work and we loved the outcome even more. So thanks for that question. Most people don't always ask about the printing. They ask about the
We might mention Robert Mulhovel.
Robert Mulhovel, who is a photographer in Galveston, was another member, and I apologize for not mentioning Robert before. We had a number of photographs that were old, very old, particularly the one of James Campbell that you saw was one of them, and because that was original. He lived in the over 100 years ago, so it was difficult for Robert. He worked very hard to enhance the quality of that photo to make it a high enough quality to go into the book so that you could see it clearly when it was reprinted. So the five of us were really joined at the hip throughout this process. So, Tom, do you want to talk about how did this collaboration come about? Which is another question we had.
Oh, well, Joe and I go back forever. I mean, he's always been disgustingly great as an artist. When we were in Sunday school and church, he'd do these pictures he'd have a piece of colored chalk in each hand, and he'd get up there and at the board, and he called them chalk talks, and he'd say Moses crossed the river and blah, blah, blah. And by the time he got through, there was this picture. So the guy is just talented. We've always wanted to do something like this. So that he was a given when we started this, and I talked to him about it, and he fell for it. But I ran into Chris in another way through the wildlife sort of thing, Galveston Island Nature Tourism Council. We were on the board, and the first time I ever met her, I thought she was somebody else, and I started talking to her, and I found out that she was not who I thought she was. And she said, well, I'm not a lawyer. And I said, oh, well. She said, I am an editor. And I said, oh, really, my dear? Let me talk to you. And so that's the way it happened.
And that's the story ever since. How about for any of us, what challenges did we face in the research process? I'll talk a little bit about that if you guys want to think of something. From my perspective in the research process, it had to do with making sure that I could validate the actual facts to a certain extent. I could track back to original documentation and original sources. Tom had given me a cardboard box, if you remember at the beginning here. And so I had a whole lot of information, and I didn't really know what information I had and what I didn't have. So that was a bit of a challenge to me, to pull it all together and then to try to decide just exactly how the book would flow. Where did we start? And so we ended up starting with the premise of the originals coming, and we called them the originals for a while, coming to this country and establishing their communities and their ranches. And we talked. So the first few chapters had to do with those three different groups, but then we needed to be able to bridge to today, because we interviewed, as Tom said, some of the Broussard family from Louisiana, and other members of and people living here in locally in Texas City, members of the Bell family from the settlement. So we needed to be able to bridge from here to there. So that we had a lot of research information and research material thanks to both of them, their personal histories, as well as the work that Tom had done and put into the cardboard box. But putting it all together in the right format took us a while. And actually, from the time I picked up that and opened up that box until we actually had a finished product, because we all three of us had other lives, took us about 3 years, actually, if I remember correctly. So, any other thoughts about our research?
No, it was very revealing to me, the research that Tom did and you and I both did along with Tom, that we have been told since we were in grade school that the vaqueros taught us everything we know about the cattle business.
Right.
Well, it was astonishing to me that this is not the facts. The facts are that the vaqueros are probably the greatest horsemen besides the Apache Indian that there ever was, and the rodeos and all that skill set. But the cattle business is by those three groups that they developed the cattle business. And as I said, way long before Stephen F. Austin 300 came to Texas, way before that. That just surprised me.
Good.
The thing that I was most concerned about was making sure that we had permission to use everything that belonged to somebody else in the book. And I watched that very carefully, and I talked to made all kind of friends all over the United States and in some foreign countries. But we have letters on file saying, yeah, you can use that and we won't sue you. And so that was, other than the new information, astonishing facts that Joe just talked about that came out. This thing about somebody coming and saying, you shouldn't be using that picture. Well, we got documentation. Hopefully we've covered all that, because that was a major concern to me.
And I think we have one more, which we've probably covered to a certain extent. What prompted you to write about the Gulf Coast Cowboys? We've talked a little bit about your ongoing conversations over the years, from the time you were young, about your reminiscences, your memories, putting them down in paper. What else prompted the two of you in your early conversations to write the book?
Well, may I answer that?
Yeah, of course.
When I found out back in the 40s that we were going to move to Texas, I was thinking, oh boy, I'm going to be where the Cowboys are. Well, little did I know that it actually was where the Cowboys were, and I didn't know it. But one of the things that we looked at was the tax records from the state of Texas when it was first formed. And at that time, of course, governments are formed so they can tax people. I guess that's why the state of Texas, or the nation.
That's a different conversation.
And that's why the nation of Texas was developed. But anyway, of course, one of the things they taxed were cattle, the heads of cattle. And there was 4 counties along the coast in this grassland area that had 1/3 of all the cattle in the entire United States in those 4 counties. And that was interesting in the research that we did.
Excellent.
We were the center of everything.
We were. I think that's all the questions that we have. Okay. All right. We want to thank you all here. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you to the library for having us. The three of us love getting together and just talking about the book, so this has been very enjoyable for us as well. So we hope you all have enjoyed it. Thank you very much for joining the call with us. Back to Teresa. Thank you.
So before we end this program, we'd like to share with our community where and how can they find your book?
That's a question for us. Okay. Sorry, I thought that was a question for you. Our contact information is on the screen. The book is available at
The Butler Longhorn Museum, the Texas City Museum, the Galveston Bookstore, and the Bryan Museum in Galveston.